Här. Hello. Nu ska vi se. Hello everyone and most welcome to 1786 of the series. We will today start with a new article by Warren D. Goldfarb. Kripke on Wittgenstein on rules. Bit complex name, to say the least. It's an ongoing debate within Wittgensteinian circles. It's whether there is the Kripke very common view of Wittgenstein, or is there any other view that is at hand? Kripke on Wittgenstein on rules. There's no doubt that Ludwig Wittgenstein thought the topic of rule following to be important. Nearly 40 sections of the philosophical investigations are devoted to it. As are large swatches of manuscripts published as remarks on the foundations of mathematics. Its relevance to Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics was emphasized early on by Michael Dummett. But only recently has it received significant attention in the less specialized context of the investigations, that is, with respect to questions of meaning and intentionality. This recent attention has, to a large extent, been engendered by Saul Kripke's exposition of Wittgenstein, first presented publicly at the 1976 Wittgenstein Colloquium in London, Ontario. And laid out more expansively in his recent book, Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language. Kripke reads Wittgenstein to be mounting a skeptical challenge to the notion of following a rule, and thereby also to the notion of meaning a word in a particular way, and then to be providing a solution to the challenge that exceeds too much of the skepticism in it. This solution, it turns out, has direct and far-reaching consequences, including the impossibility of a private language and the refutation of many traditional theories of meaning. So construed, Wittgenstein's remarks on rule following become the central and basic argument in the investigations. Indeed, they form, in an almost deductive sense, the foundation of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Kripke's reading is unquestionably a tour de force. It is sharply and forcefully drawn, couched in terms readily accessible to a wide philosophical audience, and executed with great brio. Nonetheless, there are important questions to be raised about its accuracy to Wittgenstein and its success as an independent argument. Suspicions on the former score may arise from Kripke's view of the structure of the investigations. On that view, the 184 sections that precede the remarks on rule following must be taken as mere ground clearing. These sections include the discussions of meaning and reference, family resemblance and universals, and understanding. Kripke's characterization of these markedly underestimates their intent and force. Moreover, given the strength Kripke imputes to his central argument, it is unclear that any ground clearing should even be required. Further suspicions come from Kripke's lack of detailed exegesis of the sections devoted to rule following. Much is based on a handful of them, specifically around paragraph 200. Others are cited, but often with no attention to the contexts in which they appear. Little is made, for example, of paragraphs 203 to 242, which treat relations among the notions of rule, compulsion, agreement, identity, and logic. To a considerable extent, however, an assessment of Kripke's accuracy to Wittgenstein will rest on the attractiveness of the whole package Kripke presents, on whether at least vaguely Wittgensteinian themes are clarified and woven into a compelling argument. Hence, I shall largely be concerned to examine Kripke's skeptical challenge and solution on their own. I hope to raise some doubts about Kripke's argument and about the distinction it claims to provide between language and what Kripke calls private language. These doubts do, to my mind, undermine Kripke's claim to represent Wittgenstein on the positive side. Though they may suggest a direction in Wittgenstein's thought rather different from that exhibited in Kripke's reading. Kripke sees Wittgenstein as raising a skeptical challenge to our assertions that a person means some word in a certain way. The challenge arises from the fact that everything about the person's previous utterances and performances is compatible with different ascriptions of meaning. Thus, my taking Walter Cronkite to mean chair by chair is challenged by alleging that he might mean something else, something that would have led him to use chair as even meant chair in the past, but would lead him to use chair differently in the future. This possibility is elaborated by the proposal of bizarre alternative descriptions of a Goodmanesque, Gru-like nature. In short, the finitely many uses of the word made to date do not fix what is meant, nor would verbal elaborations help, since they themselves would be subject to the same sort of question. So far, it is hard to see any force in the challenge. The ascription of meaning with which we start is supposed to be jeopardized by noting a possibility that it might turn out mistaken. Yet there is such a possibility is less evident than Kripke assumes. For it is far from clear that any odd behavior that Cronkite might suddenly start exhibiting would show that in, say, July 1984, he did not mean chair by chair. The point is just Austin's about the alleged predictive nature of factual statements, and I suspect Wittgenstein would agree. even if we grant that there are possible future responses that would undo the current ascription, all Kripke offers is a bare possibility. As such, it provides no reason to think that it is in any real sense possible that Krankheit does not mean chair by chair, and hence no reason to doubt that he does. We do, after all, engage in elaborate and articulated practices of ascribing meanings to people. We can and do justify our ascriptions when the need arises. We clear up obscurities and so on. This is our position at the start. To have force any challenge to our ascriptions must have weight enough to move us from our present ordinary position a serious skeptic must accept a burden of proof and provide some ground from which the attack proceeds. The situation here is no different from that with skepticism of more familiar kinds. A skeptical problem cannot be assumed to arise just from the logical possibility of error. To take it that skepticism about meaning can arise is to agree to a jejune global skepticism about all our knowledge and perhaps all our concepts. In any case, nothing has yet been invoked that is special about ascriptions of meaning. To be sure, what is forthcoming from Kripke, his challenge constantly takes the form of asking what fact it is about Walter Cronkite that constitutes his meaning chair by chair. This formulation shows that the skeptical challenge is not intended to operate epistemologically, despite Kripke's tendency to slip into the language of epistemological skepticism. Rather, it rests on ontological considerations. It questions whether, if everything there is were laid out before us, we could read off the correct ascriptions of meaning to people. That is why Kripke is content with raising bare possibilities of deviant ascriptions. If nothing in the world settles an issue between one or another, then we may conclude that there is nothing to be settled. Issues of whether there are any particular grounds for doubting an ascription simply do not enter. Thus, it is the notion of fact, of everything there is, that is to provide the ground for that challenge. The weight that this notion must bear may perhaps be clarified by a brief reflection on how the challenge would appear to Gottlob Frege. Frege holds that we have no notion of objective fact apart from our ability to reason, our mastery of logic. It is only against the backdrop of logic that questions of any kind can be intelligibly raised. Now, our mastery of logic presupposes our understanding of language, or as Frege terms it, our immediate access to the realm of sense. Consequently, we can never be in a position to question generally whether our words and statements have sense. Frigge's notion of fact, in short, precludes any perspective from which to challenge our immediate access to the realm of sense. That is to challenge the existence of semantic facts. Obviously, I do not intend here to assess the congruency of Frege's metaphysics and the view of logic undergirding it. I wish only to note how this conception of fact serves to turn aside Kripke's challenge. The closest Kripke comes to treating Frege's position is in his dismissal of irreducible meaning facts. This dismissal is philosophically tendentious and has no force against Frege. For Kripke's characterization of irreducible meaning facts rests on a particular conception of the factual. His exposition says nothing about how this conception is given us. It turns out, though, that the conception Kripke exploits is basically physicalistic. He talks of overt behavior, brain states, and the like, and makes full use of causal notions. The physicalism is modified by the admission of introspectable raw fields and their felt qualities. Given this conception, or perhaps given whatever implicit views give rise to it. Kripke urges that irreducible meaning facts can only be mental meaning facts that have quasi-sensory, introspectable, semantic qualities. Naturally, such curious items are easy to dismiss. Indeed, Frege himself, in his polemics against psychologism in the Foundations of Arithmetic and elsewhere, emphatically rejects any notion of introspectable meaning fact. But all this shows is that the modified physicalistic conception of fact underlying Kripke's characterization and subsequent dismissal of irreducible meaning facts is, for better or worse, quite different from Frege's identification of the realm of objective fact with the judgeable, that is, with what is subject to logic. The lack of confrontation between Kripke's challenge and Frege indicates sharply that the challenge is not what Wittgenstein means to exploit. First, I take it as clear that Wittgenstein was deeply concerned to undermine the positions of early analytic philosophy, positions that led inexorably to the Tractatus. Second, the contrast with Frege shows that Kripke's conception of fact must provide the ground of his challenge. In the end, one does not need to accept the Fregean metaphysic to turn the challenge aside. For the stance from which the challenge is launched bespeaks its own picture of what the facts are, of what everything there is comes to. If we start as Wittgenstein would urge us to, from the ordinary, then the challenge cannot arise and one cannot lay out everything there is about a person with specifying the language the person speaks. Thus, Kripke is not a purely skeptical challenge, in the sense that it does not operate by pushing on ordinary conceptions from within. Rather, it proceeds from a sophisticated notion of the limits of the objective world, and so relies on a substantial assumption Wittgenstein would, I believe, claim that such an assumption already involves a piece of philosophical sleight of the hand. Nonetheless, since the modified physicalistic notion of fact that Kripke exploits, or something close to it, is widely shared among philosophers today, it may be worthwhile to accede to it and follow the challenge out. Kripke begins by arguing that ascriptions of meaning cannot be identified with ascriptions of dispositions to respond in certain ways, because people simply do not have the appropriate dispositions. The point is familiar from Noam Chomsky's criticism of behaviorism and rests on human limitations and the consequent need for ceteris paribus clauses. That is, if we follow W.V. Quine, we take a disposition to be a physical state that causally yields a certain response under a particular stimulus. Then anyone possessing such a disposition must invariably have the response under that stimulus. Yet people have finite capacities and are prone to error, lapses of attention, apathy, and so on. No one will always exhibit the correct verbal behavior. Hence, no one has a disposition to respond correctly. Kripke's challenge to any putative physicalistic reduction of meaning extends this line of thought. The argument just given shows that meaning a word in a certain way cannot be identified with a physical state that causally yields all the future responses that are determined as correct by that meaning. The problem for the reductionist, it seems then, is to specify a physical state that allows the right exceptions. Kripke argues that there can be no delineation of these exceptions, since which cases are to be adjudged errors or other allowable violations of ideal responses cannot be specified in non-circular fashion. The required ceteris paribus clauses cannot be delimited physicalistically. The argument rests, in the end, on the enormous intricacy of our practices surrounding ascriptions of meaning, particularly those of ascription of error rather than change of meaning, or vice versa. Kripke's point is that the characterization of those practices, and hence of the relation of behavior to meaning, already requires the use of meaning notions. Consequently, there's no purely physicalistic way of specifying a physical state that is identifiable with meaning a word in a certain way. Kripke is thus charging that reductionists illicitly assume as known what the conditions are on a physical state that would allow it to be identified with meaning. This is a powerful consideration. It deserves further elaboration, and any reductionist should be concerned to provide the details of his program that would answer it. At the level of at the level of generality at which Kripke operates, however, the point is inconclusive. A reductionist could claim, for example, that future physiological psychology might reveal two mechanisms separable on scientific grounds. States of the first amount to a person's linguistic competence and would, if untrammeled, always cause correct responses. States of the second are identifiable with interfering features, which explain why, on particular occasions, the first mechanism does not issue in an appropriate response, and the person errs. Of course, in the empirical work that leads to these identifications, we must use our ordinary meaning ascriptions and practices of ascribing error. In the end, though, we can identify the physical states of the first mechanism as constituting meaning words in a certain way. To be sure, this is speculative, but nothing Kripke adduces rules it out in principle. Kripke would apparently claim that this speculation underestimates the extent of the issue raised by error, the issue of what he calls normativity. To identify meaning and a physical state, he says, would be to give a descriptive account of the relation between one's meaning, the word, and one's future use of the word. But the relation of meaning and intention to future action is normative, not descriptive. As he elaborates, one's meaning does not determine how one will use the word, but rather how one should use it. Kripke connects this with justification. Any candidate for a fact of meaning must in some sense show how I am justified in going to use the word in a certain way. And I think that could be a good point to put a pause. And certain way. And we have 786. Certain way. Let's see if I can find some sites. The first couple of pages are not containing much of material, but if you go to 474, it's a start on the closer look at Kripke et al. I'll say Kripke is not alone. It's the first pointer. This is more of a general problematics. It's the 6th line, I think it is. Yes, 6th line. To take it that skepticism of meaning can so arise is to agree to a genuine global skepticism about all our knowledge and perhaps all our concepts. So Kripke is indirectly launching a quite massive attack or front. If we go down to the end of the second paragraph, it's a short sentence that sort of sums it up. The Fregean Kripkean viewpoint. Thus, it is the notion of fact, of everything there is, that is to provide the ground of the challenge. This is, in short, challenging or pointing to a sort of a battle. I'm exaggerating here now, but between epistemology, empiricism, and what Wittgenstein called grammar. Kripke are hinting to that by looking at the world, we can find the sense in the words. So to understand the meaning of something, we need to look at the world, to see what it means. And it's not so hard to see that that is almost amounting to the same as reductionism, scientism, and so forth. And everything in the language is going to be challenged somehow. And you'd be left with maybe, according to Frege, only a few terms that are safe and sure. But the general conception is somewhere beyond language we should turn to check where the language is correct. Find the object in the world, see if it relates correctly to our conception of a certain word, concept, term, and then we say, that is correct. And you can see the name Kripke as an acronym for every philosopher ever known to earth. It covers everything, almost. So if you go to, what will this lead to? Well, let's go to page 475 and about 8 lines down. And although this article was written in 1985, long before any serious attempts of AI, it's absolutely clear that Kripke as you can hear here, it turns out, though, that the conception Kripke exploits is basically physicalistic. He talks of overt behavior, brain states, and the like, and make full use of causal notions. So the world can be found in our brain. Our actions, our thinking is in our brain, and they correspond to physical processes. That is the bedrock in Kripke. And analytic philosophy and reductionism, I would say, and this is my personal opinion, that is also the common sense attitude. If we go down to the second paragraph here, this would be something that is obvious to most of you who've been participating in these lectures, but it bears repeating. First, this is the 4th line down from what we can see here. First, I take it as clear that Wittgenstein was deeply concerned to undermine the positions of early analytical philosophy. Positions to him that led inexorably to the Tractatus. Second, the contrast with Frege shows that Kripke's conception of fact must provide the ground of this challenge. And if we go down to the end, if we start, as Wittgenstein would urge us to, from the ordinary, then the challenge cannot arise. One cannot lay out everything there is about a person with specifying the language the person speaks. And the last part, specifying the language the person speaks, would be all the epistemology, all the ontology, all the scientific data, so to speak, to know the truth value of what the person is saying, to know whether the words the person is uttering are true or not, corresponding to a grid, if you like, or as in the examples that we had a couple of times, say with the Bible texts, or looking to the original scroll to know the truth value of certain Bible verses. Could you see here how it parallels into all subjects? It is not enough to hear a statement, it needs to be checked. Do not fall into the pit of thinking that Wittgenstein is questioning science here. What he's questioning is scientism. In those cases where the words are absolutely clear and turning to an original or a source, that is what meant by Kripke is looking for causal reasons, either in brain states or somewhere out there, finding the right constellation of atoms to prove the truth of a certain statement or proposition, which is not in the area of that narrow field, which is science. Goldfarb calls this a physicalistic sense of Kripke. The beginning of page 476. I believe that the claim that such an assumption already involves a piece of philosophical sleight of hand. None of the less, since the modified physicalistic notion of fact that Kripke exploits, or something close to it, is widely, and this is cannot be overstated, is widely shared among philosophers today. It may be worthwhile to accede to it and follow the challenge out, which I've done here. This is also the physicalism that gives cause to David Chalmers, The Hard Problem, what is consciousness, and so on. At the end of this page, at the end of the last paragraph, we find consequently there is no purely, if you go down to the very bottom of the page, there's no purely physicalistic way of specifying a physical state that is identifiable with meaning a word in a certain way. Kripke is that thus charging that reductionists illicitly assume as known what the conditions are on a physical state that would allow it to be identified with meaning. This is a powerful consideration. It deserves further elaboration, and any reductionist should be concerned to provide the details of his program that would answer it. He is putting the foundations of reductionism very clearly. And I think he's speaking in a sense that makes sense to everyone. It's common language. Wittgenstein does, however, not agree. And I think you've been following this series would be starting to understand that there is actually quite a gap between Wittgenstein and this Kripkean view that is shared by so many. That words are not enough, concepts are not enough in cases where it doesn't make any sense to look at the physicality. I would say it makes no sense whatsoever to look for a physicality when it comes to intention, my emotions, my wants, and for that matter, what on earth is consciousness or my soul? To ask where in the physicality is my soul is nonsensical, because nothing corresponds to physically to the soul. Physicality is a limited word game that has to do with classical physics. And it has a very small role to play in the actual world, in the real world with relations, where everything is interrelated and nothing is separable in that strange way that Kripke is sort of assuming that I can tell the world what is physical. I can sort of cut off the physical from the rest of the world. And me, as Saul Kripke, I can have a system that tells whether a word is reflecting the physicality of the world or a certain proposition is correct outside of a very narrow domain of classical physics. That things pertaining to the world in general are mental states and so on, and you will end up as a brain in a vat. Okay, Kalle, shoot.
So on this page 8, I'm not certain that I understand what Goldfarb is stating. Kripke is asserting that the reductionists illicitly assume as known what the conditions are on a physical state that would allow it to be identified with meaning. This is a powerful consideration. So Kripke, on the one hand, says that our physical states correspond to meaning.
Yes, it corresponds to meaning, and it also corresponds to, could be said to correspond to objects. So if I see a chair in my head, there is a certain physical state that sort of corresponds to a chair.
But okay, that's also how I understood. But I think Goldfarb is a little bit ambiguous here. So it means that Goldfarb is to a certain degree agreeing with Kripke. It deserves further elaboration. I don't know.
He doesn't disagree here. He just says it's a very powerful consideration. But later you will see, and earlier, that he doesn't agree. Yes, yes.
So
It's a pretty. What he means is it is a pretty strong claim.
absolutely. So this on page 6 or 475, the last two lines, rather it proceeds as a Kripke's opinion, proceeds from a sophisticated notion of the limits of the objective world. And as you say, that the world that we see is not only the words that are limited, and our thinking is limited, but also the world is limited in one way. Everything is limited.
Yeah, the world comes in there. It does definitely, and it becomes a sort of a checkup, and that this is what is referred to in the text as physicalism or physicality or epistemology.
And I also noticed that Kripke uses the word error often, and I was thinking that for Wittgenstein, game was important, like soccer or chess or so forth. But do you think about error in a game like chess or soccer? You can say that this game made a beautiful move, or that they won. But how often do you hear commenters say that this chess player, he made an error, or I don't know if the word error is a good way of describing how game works, or what do you think, Hans?
Yeah, it's a rather tricky sentence you choose there, but
there's more, I think, on the next page about. But I think errors in general, you see here like a person errs.
yes.
I don't know. You can let's say in chess, you can have a move. It can be a successful move. You kill one of the opponent's pieces. But I don't know. It's tricky to speak about errors. Because you have to then think about it in also in language, and such errors on why does not Kripke and Goldfarb speak more about game and physical states? Wittgenstein he does speak about our inner state, that the inner state is wrong. He speaks about the inner private language is not possible according to Wittgenstein.
No, not a completely private language with no connection to anything else. He is a private language defender would be a classical physicist, for instance, that would say that everything that happens in the world is separable. It's sort of local reality. So you can separate things out, and You can call those things inner. You can also call them outer, depending where you are standing. But the important thing of the claim, if there were such a person as a defender of private language, we say, which I doubt, but we assume it's problematic. It would lead to the idea that actually, if you isolate something from the global relational Carlo-Rovellian quantum relationship, actually, you wouldn't be sure what you were saying yourself. You couldn't be sure of your own thinking. He's pointing to a paradox here.
And here we read, of course, in the empirical work that leads to these identifications, we must use our ordinary meaning ascriptions and practice of ascribing error.
Yes.
So for Wittgenstein, I think he stated that for rules, how did he put it? The rules, they can be general. Rules are always general, but the application is context-based. For instance, language laws in a country, they are quite general, but then you have to have the judge who takes in consideration the context.
Yeah, you need a judge. Yeah.
Of course, it's relevant to speak about doing errors. Someone has done an error, and you need a judge. But to limit everything to physical states, I think is problematic. And what is great about gaming is, of course, the fun. And I don't see the fun part in Kripke. Everything is only reactions, like a robot acting to things. Like if you hit your knee, then you react. But I don't see the fun in the games that Kripke is doing.
Mm-hmm. You are speaking of behaviorism now.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, I think behaviorism is Skinner who invented it. It's like you're trapped in a corner and you don't have any other explanation. And I was forced to, not forced, but I was forced by logic to accept behaviorism at a certain point. But there are ways out of behaviorism. But this is actually one of those ways. Another thing is that could be helpful to think about if you go into the idea of your own words, what you are saying or what some authority is saying can be, as you say, judged by an external judge, like physicality or objectivization or science. You make yourself and your language weak incredibly dependent on something that is way out of your control. And this is one of the reasons, this is my point of view, this is not Goldfarb speaking or Kripke, but in my point of view, it makes you absolutely dependent on things you have no control of, things you can't know. Because in the end, how will your connection be to a certain lab where they check out with their consciousness? It becomes very far away. So even if the results were supposed to be absolutely clear, that would be very, very far from you, very far. It wouldn't make any sense in the end, actually.
Yes, indeed, and we use only judge or police in extreme circumstances. And in that sense, and also in case of serious error. So I don't know if it's to speak about error, like imagine like a teacher in a school correctly or grammar mistakes. I think that is I don't know. It's a bit simplistic. Like in a sense, you will not be. There are only good moves and less good moves, I would say. I don't know, errors. Yes, perhaps if your king or queen dies. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we can continue this. It's quite interesting. But we're hitting the 8 o'clock mark here, and I think maybe, what do you say, Kalle?
Yes, we should end there, I think too.
I say thank you very much to Kalle Lundahl for participating. And thank you everyone for listening in. Have a very nice morning, day, or afternoon. Bye bye for now, and I know. And